The date is July 22, 1209. It's a hot morning in southern France. Inside the walled city of Béziers, thousands of people, men and women, priests and merchants, children and old men, are jammed into the stone sanctuary of a church called St. Mary Magdalene. They're praying. Outside, an army wearing the cross of Christ is battering down the doors. By noon, almost none of them will be alive. And that is what makes this morning so difficult to comprehend. The army outside was Christian. The people inside were Christian. And the war that had brought them together on this street had been declared by the Pope himself, in the name of Christ, against fellow Christians in the middle of Christendom. How does that happen? How does the same Roman Church that had spent 100 years sending knights across the sea to fight Muslims in Jerusalem end up marching a Christian army to slaughter a Christian city in southern France? And how does a religious crackdown over the next 20 years mutate into something even bigger, a campaign of conquest that redraws the map of Europe and erases an entire civilization from it? To understand that, we have to go back decades before that summer morning at Béziers, to a strange, sunlit country that spoke its own language, listened to its own poets, and had begun to believe some very unusual things about God. At the end of the 12th century, southern France did not think of itself as France. It thought of itself as the Languedoc, the country where people said "Ac" for yes. The Latin regions north of the Loire River said oil. That single sound marked the border between two civilizations inside the same modern hexagon. The Languedoc for short, was a Mediterranean world. Its ports opened onto Italy and Spain. Its cities were old, walled, and rich from trade. Its landscape ran from the Rhone River in the east, across sun-baked plains dotted with hilltop fortresses called castra, to the shadow of the Pyrenees in the south. Politically, it was nothing like the north. The kings of France up in Paris ruled a slowly consolidating feudal state. In Languedoc, no such single ruler existed. Power was scattered among the counts of Toulouse, the wealthiest family in the region, the Trencavel viscounts, who held Béziers and Carcassonne, the counts of Foix up in the mountains, and the neighboring king of Aragon just over the Pyrenees. Below them, wealthy merchant councils, called consulates, ran the cities almost as independent republics. Even inheritance worked differently. In the north, the eldest son took everything. In the south, estates were divided among all the children. That meant nobody in Languedoc accumulated the kind of concentrated wealth and power a northern baron did. And this fragmented, wealthy, trade-connected world had produced a culture the North found deeply unsettling. Its poets, the troubadours, sang about a new invention called fin amour, courtly love, the idea that romantic devotion between a knight and a lady could be as spiritually elevating as prayer. They wrote in the Languedoc itself, not in Latin. And their songs were often savage about the church, mocking greedy bishops, corrupt priests, and monks who preached poverty while dining rich. That was the world into which a new religion, or something the Roman Church would eventually decide was a religion, quietly slipped in. They called themselves simply the good men and good women, bonhomme and bonne femme in Occitan. Everyone else eventually called them cathars, from a Greek word meaning pure. What they actually believed is worth pausing on because it explains why Rome eventually decided they had to be exterminated. The Cathars believed the universe was divided between two gods. A good god, spiritual, had created the world of souls. An evil god, often equated with the God of the Old Testament, had created the material world, the physical body, food, reproduction, money. Kings, bishops, everything you could see and touch was by definition the work of the evil creator. To be saved, a soul had to escape the material world entirely through poverty, through celibacy, through refusing meat and oaths and marriage and property. That was the theology. In practice, it took a very simple form. Ordinary Cathar believers lived normal lives. They married, ate, worked, paid taxes. But above them was a small ascetic elite called the perfects. Perfects wore black robes and took vows of poverty, ate no meat and no dairy, and traveled the countryside preaching and administering a single ritual called the consolamentum, a laying on of hands that was the only sacrament they recognized. Most believers received it only once on their deathbeds. There was no Cathar Pope, no cathedrals, no standardized theology written down anywhere. In many Languedoc villages, the perfects lived in ordinary houses sheltered by ordinary nobles. In some towns, the Cathar community and the Catholic community used the same streets and sometimes the same families. It was less an organized rival church than a loose, decentralized network of ascetic holy men and holy women who walked the south, fed and protected by people who admired them. And by the middle of the 12th century, a lot of people admired them. Because compared to the perfects, poor, celibate, non-violent, refusing all luxury, the local Catholic clergy looked corrupt, wealthy, and hypocritical. And the troubadours were already saying so out loud. Rome noticed. In 1147, Rome sent its most famous preacher, a Cistercian monk named Bernard of Clairvaux, who had personally launched the Second Crusade, down to Languedoc to bring the region back to orthodoxy. He rode through Toulouse, Albi, Verfeil. He found churches nearly empty, priests derided in the streets, whole villages that listened politely to his sermons and then went back to their good men. He returned to Rome shaken. Standard preaching, he reported, was not working. That was the first warning. It would take Rome another 60 years to reach the conclusion the papacy eventually drew. Words alone were not going to fix this. Councils were called. In 1163, at the Council of Tours, the Pope formally condemned the heretics of Languedoc and forbade anyone in Christendom to shelter them, trade with them, or bury them. In 1179, the Third Council of the Lateran went further. It declared the Cathars anathema and offered for the first time spiritual indulgences to Christians who took up arms against them. That was a legal earthquake. Indulgences had been the currency of the Crusades to Jerusalem. Now they were being offered for killing heretics inside Europe. But the offer was theoretical. Nobody actually took up arms. Languedoc's local bishops mostly ignored Rome's demands. The Counts of Toulouse mostly ignored the local bishops, and the good men kept preaching. Then, on January 8, 1198, a 37-year-old canon lawyer named Lothair of Sagny was elected pope. He took the name Innocent III, and everything about the papacy's approach to Languedoc changed. Innocent III was the youngest man elected pope in living memory. He was Roman-born aristocratic, formally trained in law at Bologna and theology at Paris. He believed absolutely that the Pope's authority stood above every king in Christendom, and that religious dissent was not just error. It was treason against God, and it justified the use of force. He had inherited a 50-year-old problem in southern France. He had no intention of letting it slide any further. For the first 6 years of his reign, he tried the diplomatic route. He sent papal legates south, churchmen with authority to bypass the local bishops and negotiate directly with lords and towns. He gave them power to strip corrupt clergy of their offices. He asked them to preach barefoot in poverty, to look more like the perfects and less like the wealthy Roman churchmen the Occitans mocked. And in 1204, he appointed as his chief agent in the region a stern Cistercian abbot named Arnaud Amalric, the abbot of Citeaux, the mother monastery of the entire Cistercian order. A man whose willingness to compromise, by every account, was zero. None of it worked. The local nobility protected the perfects. The city councils ignored the excommunications. Southern bishops resented the papal legates as northern intruders. And the most powerful ruler in the entire south, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, a sophisticated prince who ruled a territory almost the size of a small kingdom, declined politely and repeatedly to hunt heretics on his own lands. Raymond was not himself a Cathar. He was a pragmatic Catholic. But his nobles were interwoven with Cathar families. His subjects included many perfects. His court, like every court in the South, mocked the Catholic clergy in troubadour songs. He understood that if he tried to purge his own territories, he would trigger a civil war among his own vassals. So he temporized. He signed the treaties Rome demanded. Then he ignored them. By the beginning of 1207, Innocent III's patience had run out. His legate, Pierre de Castelnau-Arnaud Amalric's chief deputy, a young, uncompromising Cistercian, traveled through Provence, issuing warnings and demanding that Raymond join a formal league to hunt heretics. Raymond refused. In May of that year, Castelnau excommunicated the Count of Toulouse and placed his lands under interdict, meaning no marriages, no burials, No sacraments could legally take place in his territories. It was the most public humiliation available to the medieval church. The two men met one last time in January 1208 on the marshy banks of the Rhone River near the town of Saint-Gilles. The conversation, by all accounts, ended in shouting. Raymond may or may not have threatened Castelnau. Castelnau, according to the chroniclers, told the count he was riding to Rome to have him formally deposed. The next dawn, January 14, 1208, as Castelnau prepared to cross the river, a mounted knight rode up behind him and drove a lance through his back. He died in the mud, forgiving his killer. The knight escaped. He has never been definitively identified, but he had come from the direction of Raymond's territories, and the papacy did not need proof. When the news reached Rome, Pope Innocent III wept in public. And then, within weeks, he did something no pope had ever done. On March 10, 1208, he issued a bull, a formal papal letter, titled Rem Gravi in Quadam. It called upon the King of France and every northern French baron to take the cross, not against Muslims in the Holy Land, against fellow Christians in Languedoc. It promised full crusader indulgences, the same salvation offered to soldiers who had fought at Jerusalem. In a line whose consequences would ripple for the next 20 years, it declared that the lands of any noble who protected heretics were forfeit and could be seized by whoever conquered them. That last line was the fire. Because the north of France was full of younger sons, barons without inheritance, knights without land, ambitious men whose family estates had gone to their older brothers under the northern law of primogeniture. And now the Pope was offering them in a single document salvation for their souls and someone else's land for their body. The response was enormous. Through the winter of 1208 and the spring of 1209, an army began gathering at Lyon, the largest army raised in Western Europe since the First Crusade a century earlier. Estimates vary widely, but somewhere between 10 and 20,000 fighting men, along with a large trailing mass of camp followers prepared to ride south. Raymond of Toulouse, the man Rome had spent 4 years trying to bring to heel, watched the muster from his capital. He was not a stupid man, and he did what any Occitan lord in that position would have done. He decided to save himself by joining the crusade against his own people. Raymond of Toulouse arrived at the church door of Saint-Gilles on June 18, 1209, the same church whose steps Pierre de Castelnau had died on 18 months earlier. He was stripped to the waist. A rope was placed around his neck. And in front of the assembled papal legates, the Archbishop of Auch, and every noble in southern France who cared to watch Arnaud Amalric, the same stern Cistercian abbot Innocent III had sent to reform Languedoc, publicly scourged the most powerful lord in the south, whipping his bare back across the porch of the church while reading his penance aloud. Raymond took it. He asked forgiveness. Then he did the one thing that made the humiliation worth it. He took the cross himself. He joined the crusade. Under church law, this was decisive. A crusader's lands were sacred, protected from attack by any other crusader for the duration of his vow. In one act of public shame, Raymond had legally immunized Toulouse. The army raised to destroy him could no longer touch him. The crusaders were furious. Thousands of men had marched south to burn heretics and seize southern estates, and now the largest, richest heretic protector in the south was walking beside them wearing the same cross they were. The papal legates read the situation instantly. If they could not attack Toulouse, they had to redirect the crusade at someone else, fast, before the army's momentum died. And there was one target the army could still legally destroy. Raymond VI's nephew, a 24-year-old Occitan lord named Raymond Roger Troncavel, ruled the neighboring Viscounty of Béziers and Carcassonne. His territories were full of Cathar perfects. His family had been feuding with the counts of Toulouse for generations, and unlike his uncle, he had not taken the cross. The army turned east. On July 21, 1209, it reached the walls of Béziers. The next morning is where our story began. And here it is worth slowing down, because for 800 years, one line has survived from that morning, and the line is not exactly true. The story goes like this. As the Crusader troops moved to storm the city, the soldiers turned to the papal legate, Arnaud Amalric, the man in charge of the Crusade's spiritual direction, and asked him a practical question. Most of the people inside the walls of Béziers were Catholic. Only a small minority were Cathar. So how were the soldiers supposed to tell them apart? And Arnaud Amalric, according to the famous story, said, "Kill them all, the Lord will know his own." Except that is not quite what happened. The line was first written down 13 years after the massacre by a German Cistercian monk named Caesarius of Heisterbach, who had never been to Béziers and had never met Arnaud Amalric. Most modern historians treat the quote as a rhetorical dramatization rather than a verbatim transcript. Whether Arnaud Amalric ever said those exact words is genuinely unknown. What is not unknown, what is documented by nearly every chronicler on both sides, is the outcome. Because the outcome was almost exactly what the famous quote describes. The sack began before the Crusader commanders had planned to attack. The camp followers, the rabauds, the ragged mass of hungry, unpaid poor, who trailed medieval armies looking for plunder, got past the outer walls first. Once they were inside, the Crusader soldiers followed. What happened next lasted only a few hours. Thousands of citizens fled to the churches, to the Cathedral of Saint-Nazaire, and above all to the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, believing that no Christian soldier would violate a sanctuary. They were wrong. The doors were broken. The altars were hacked apart. Priests were killed in vestments. When the Crusaders set the roofs on fire, the churches burned with the people inside. Estimates of the dead vary. Medieval chroniclers claim numbers as high as 100,000, which is impossible. But the scholarly consensus puts the number between 15 and 20,000. Meaning that in a single morning, in something like 3 hours, an army raised by the Pope had wiped out, effectively, the entire population of a medieval city, Catholic and Cathar together, priests and children and merchants and old men, without stopping to distinguish between them. That is the historical event. And that is the source of the psychological terror that made the next 20 years possible. Because when the news of Béziers spread across Languedoc, and it spread within days, dozens of southern towns and castles simply surrendered without fighting. Nobody wanted to be Béziers. The army moved west and reached Carcassonne 2 weeks later, on August 1st, 1209. Carcassonne was a fortified city on a hill, thick-walled, defensible, well-garrisoned. Trencavel himself had ridden inside to defend it. But the summer was brutal. The cisterns were low, the population had swollen with refugees, and after 2 weeks the water was running out. On August 15th, Trencavel rode out of the gates under a flag of truce to negotiate. He was arrested on the spot. The Crusaders let the population walk out of Carcassonne in their underclothes, leaving everything else behind, and took the city. Trencavel, the 24-year-old Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne, was thrown into his own dungeon. He was dead within 3 months. His widow was told he had died of dysentery. Nobody at the time, and nobody since, has quite believed it. Now the crusade had a problem. Trencavel's lands had been taken. They needed a new lord. But the northern French dukes and counts who had come south for their 40 days of crusader service, the standard legal obligation, were one by one packing up and going home. Their vows were fulfilled. Their souls were saved. They were not interested in permanent residence in a hostile country. There was one man who was. Simon IV de Montfort was a minor northern baron. His family estates were small. He was in his early 40s, quiet, iron-disciplined, and famously pious. He had been on the Fourth Crusade 7 years earlier, and he had done something almost nobody else on that expedition had done. He had refused to participate in the sack of the Christian city of Constantinople and had walked away from the crusade in disgust rather than attack fellow Christians. That is the man who now accepted, from the hands of Arnaud Amalric, the Viscounty of Béziers and Carcassonne, and the title of Supreme Military Commander of the Crusade in Languedoc. The contradiction is striking. The man who had refused to slaughter Christians in Constantinople in 1204 would spend the next 9 years slaughtering Christians in Languedoc without any recorded moment of hesitation. What had changed was not Simon. What had changed was the label. The Greeks at Constantinople had been schismatics, wrong Christians, but Christians. The Cathars had been declared heretics, which, in the theological framework Innocent III had built, made them worse than infidels. They were not simply misguided. They were a spiritual infection. And Simon de Montfort believed absolutely that his sword was cleaning a wound. For the next 4 years, the crusade was Simon de Montfort, and Simon de Montfort was a brilliant, ruthless, tireless commander who moved his understrength army across Languedoc faster than the southern lords could coordinate resistance. The first major test came at Minerve, a natural fortress town built on a limestone spur ringed by deep canyons in the summer of 1210. The place was almost impossible to storm, but it had one well in a gully at the base of the walls, and Simon's siege engines bombarded that well until the defenders were drinking rainwater. On July 22nd, 1210, exactly 1 year to the day after Béziers-Minerve surrendered, inside the citadel, the Crusaders found something they had not encountered at Béziers or Carcassonne. They found the community that was actually the target of this war. 140 Cathar perfects, men and women, had taken shelter in Minerve during the siege. Arnaud Amalric, still with the army, offered them a formal choice. Recant your beliefs, kiss the cross, take Catholic communion, and you will live. Refuse, and you will be burned together in a single fire. None of them recanted. All 140 walked hand in hand into a bonfire built in the dry riverbed below the town, singing hymns as the flames took them. This was the first mass execution for heresy in the history of Western Europe, and it established what would become the signature ritual of the entire 20-year crusade: the collective pyre. Perfects who would not deny their faith were no longer executed individually. They were burned together in enormous fires. It made the killings faster, it made them louder, and it turned the deaths of the perfects into public performances designed to break the will of everyone watching. 10 months later, at Lavore, the pattern deepened. Simon captured the town after a brutal siege in May 1211. He hanged the 80 defending knights from the walls. He personally supervised the execution of the town's lord, an Occitan noblewoman named Dame Gerard de Loric, who was thrown into a well and stoned to death as crusaders hurled rocks down onto her. Then, in the field outside the walls, he built a bonfire large enough to burn 400 Cathar perfects at once. It remained the single largest execution of the entire crusade. Two things were now clear to the south. First, the crusade was not going to stop at destroying the perfects. It was going to destroy the Occitan nobility that sheltered them, along with the norms of chivalry that had traditionally protected noble women in medieval war. Second, if Languedoc was going to survive, it needed an outside protector powerful enough to face down a papal army. There was exactly one candidate. King Peter II of Aragon was in 1213 the most celebrated Christian monarch in southern Europe. He had crushed the Almohad Caliphate at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa the previous summer, the single greatest Christian victory of the Reconquista. He had been crowned in Rome personally by Pope Innocent III. He was on paper the model of a Crusader king, and his sister was married to Raymond VI of Toulouse, while the Viscounts of Béziers were tied to him through complicated feudal relationships across the Pyrenees. In the summer of 1213, Peter did what he could not have done a year earlier. He formally demanded that Innocent III call off the crusade and restore the confiscated Occitan lands to their rightful lords. Innocent III wavered. He briefly ordered Simon de Montfort to stop. Then, under pressure from Arnaud Amalric and the northern French bishops, he reversed himself, and Peter II of Aragon crossed the Pyrenees with an army. The two forces met at Muret, a fortified town on the plain south of Toulouse, on September 12, 1213. The numbers looked hopeless for Simon. The combined Aragonese-Occitan army was somewhere between 10 and 12,000 men. Simon de Montfort commanded roughly 800 knights and 1,000 infantry. He was outnumbered 6-1. But Simon had discipline, and Peter had chivalric pride. To prove his personal valor in front of the assembled Occitan lord, Peter swapped armor with a common knight and rode in the front rank of the vanguard cavalry charge. When Simon's tightly drilled heavy cavalry punched into the disorganized front of the Aragonese-Occitan line, the Crusaders swarmed the disguised king. He was unhorsed. He was killed on the ground. His head was raised on a lance to break the morale of his troops. It worked. The entire relief army routed within an hour. Peter II of Aragon, hero of Las Navas de Tolosa, was dead in a field in southern France. And with him died the last realistic hope of foreign protection for Languedoc. From this point on, Simon de Montfort could rewrite the map of southern France at will, while the northern French monarchy watched and calculated how much of the resulting empire it might eventually inherit. The formal recognition came 2 years later. In November 1215, at the Fourth Council of the Lateran, the largest ecclesiastical assembly of the medieval church, presided over by Innocent III himself, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse was formally and permanently stripped of all his hereditary titles. His entire domain was awarded to Simon de Montfort. The papacy had now put its supreme legal seal on the confiscation of a sovereign Occitan dynasty by a northern French baron. Everything was over. On paper. Except Raymond VI was not dead, and he had a son. In the summer of 1216, Raymond VI and his teenage son Raymond VII returned from exile in Aragon. What happened next surprised everyone, including Simon de Montfort. The population of Languedoc, 6 years into the crusade, had not been broken. If anything, the terror had made them hate the northerners more. Cities that had surrendered without a fight in 1209 now rose in armed revolt against Simon's northern garrisons. Rebel Occitan lords who had been dispossessed came out of hiding. Within a year, most of the eastern countryside had switched sides again. On September 13, 1217, Count Raymond VI rode back into his own capital of Toulouse to cheering crowds. The northern French garrison inside the city was overwhelmed. The gates were rebuilt, the trebuchets were rearmed, and the population of Toulouse, every man, every woman, every child, prepared to defend the walls against the army they knew was coming. Simon de Montfort arrived within weeks. He laid siege to Toulouse in October 1217 and settled in for what would become the longest, ugliest, most exhausting operation of his career. The siege lasted 9 months, and during those 9 months, something unusual happened inside Toulouse. The city ran its own war effort. The consulate, the merchant council, organized food distribution. The nobles ran the sallies. And on the walls, working the artillery, were the women of the city. Building the machines was heavy labor. Operating them, loading, sighting, releasing, required trained crews. And Toulouse had noblewomen and townswomen taking turns at the machines around the clock. On June 25, 1218, one of those machines did what 9 months of siege had failed to do. The morning had begun with a crusader sortie against the Toulousan defenses. Simon's brother Guy was hit by a crossbow bolt and went down. Simon rode out from his command position to defend his brother and rally the crusader line. He rode into range of a siege engine operated by a crew of Toulousan women on the ramparts above him. They released it. A stone weighing approximately 100 pounds arced down from the wall. It struck Simon de Montfort square on the top of his steel helmet. The Occitan chronicler wrote in the Languedoc, "The stone came straight to where it was needed and struck Count Simon on his steel helmet, shattering his eye, his brain, and his teeth. He was dead before his body hit the ground." The 9-year terror of Languedoc had ended with a stone launched from the city he was trying to conquer. And within days of his death, the entire northern position in Languedoc began to unravel. His son, Amaury de Montfort, inherited the title, but not the terror. Rebel castles rose from Nîmes to the Pyrenees. Toulouse itself was liberated. And over the next 5 years, from 1218 to 1223, almost every conquest Simon de Montfort had made in 9 years of merciless warfare was quietly, systematically taken back by the Occitan lords he had thought he had destroyed. The Crusade of Innocent III, the Crusade of Simon de Montfort, the Crusade of the Sack of Béziers, the Crusade of Minerve and Lavaur and Muret, was by 1223 effectively over. The Cathars were still there. The Perfects were still there. The southern civilization was still there. Everything Simon de Montfort had built had collapsed with him. And that should have been the end of the story. For 5 years, no pope, no king, and no legate could pull the northern effort together again. Amaury de Montfort, Simon's son, held on to a few strongholds and slowly bled money into them. He lost battles. He lost castles. He lost his father's veterans. By 1223, he had almost nothing left. And in early 1224, he formally surrendered his father's confiscated titles back to the King of France in exchange for a pension. He rode north and never came back. Raymond VI of Toulouse died in 1222, still excommunicated, forbidden a Christian burial. His body was left in a wooden coffin in the courtyard of the Knights Hospitaller in Toulouse, and it stayed there, in the open air, for the next 300 years, because no bishop would ever authorize its internment. His son Raymond VII inherited a county that had been, on paper, awarded to Simon de Montfort by the Pope. In practice, Raymond VII controlled almost all of it. By 1225, Languedoc was effectively back to where it had been in 1208. The Cathars were still there. The Perfects were still preaching. The Occitan lords were back in their castles. 16 years of holy war had accomplished nothing. And that should have been the end of the story. Except that, by this point, the crusade had stopped being about the Cathars. The papacy that had launched the war in 1208 was gone. Innocent III had died in 1216. Arnaud Amalric had died in 1225. The generation of legates and reformers who had believed honestly that they were saving Christendom from a spiritual infection was passing off the stage. What replaced them was a very different institution, the French royal crown. It had spent 16 years watching the crusade from a careful distance and calculating what it might be worth. The French monarchy had reasons to want Languedoc. The old king, Philip II, had been busy consolidating Normandy and had left the crusade to his barons. His son, Louis VIII, who took the throne in 1223, had different instincts. Louis VIII was aggressive, ambitious, and unlike his father, he could see clearly what the papacy had already done for him. The church had spent a generation legally destroying the sovereignty of the Counts of Toulouse. All the French crown had to do was walk in and pick up the pieces. On January 30th, 1226, Louis VIII of France formally took the cross and announced a royal crusade against Languedoc. This was a different animal from the crusade of Simon de Montfort. Simon had led a private army of adventurers seeking absolution and land. Louis VIII arrived at the head of the full military resources of the French crown. Royal troops, siege engineers, treasury logistics, the entire administrative apparatus of a medieval state. When the royal army moved south in the summer of 1226, most of the Occitan strongholds surrendered without a fight. Not because the terror of 1209 had returned, because everyone in Languedoc could see correctly that fighting the King of France was categorically different from fighting a papal legate. Louis VIII himself did not live to finish his war. He caught dysentery on the march and died in November 1226, only 10 months after taking the cross. He left behind a 12-year-old son who would become one of the most famous kings in French history, Louis IX, later canonized as Saint Louis, and a fiercely competent regent, his widow, Blanche of Castile. She continued the campaign without pause. Royal armies wintered in Languedoc. Royal officials replaced Occitan ones. Southern lords who tried to hold out found their supply lines cut and their neighbors defecting. By the winter of 1228, Raymond VII of Toulouse had been fighting on and off for 12 years. His treasury was empty. His nobles were exhausted. His allies were dead or neutralized. Blanche of Castile's negotiators offered him a way out. He took it. The Treaty of Paris, sometimes called the Treaty of Meaux Paris, was signed on April 12, 1229. It ended the Albigensian Crusade. It also ended the independence of Occitan Languedoc. The terms were surgical. Raymond VII kept the title of Count of Toulouse for his lifetime, but nearly half his hereditary lands were ceded immediately to the French crown. His fortification, from Toulouse itself to 50 smaller castles, had to be dismantled or handed over to royal garrisons. His only child, his 9-year-old daughter Joan, was betrothed to Louis IX's younger brother, Alphonse of Poitiers. That meant, when Raymond VII died, the last of the Toulousan dynasty would pass through his own daughter into the French royal house. And to seal the humiliation, Raymond VII himself was required to be scourged publicly at the doors of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, in a ceremony deliberately echoing the one his father had endured at St. Gilles 20 years earlier. He did it. He kept his title. And when he died in 1249, his daughter Joan was already the Countess of Toulouse, married to a Capetian prince ruling in the name of the French crown. When she and her husband died childless in 1271, everything Toulouse, Béziers, Carcassonne, Nîmes, the whole of the Languedoc was legally absorbed into France. The wealthy, decentralized troubadour civilization that had refused to hunt heretics in 1207 was, by the end of the century, a province of Paris. That was the political ending. But it was not the whole ending, because when the treaty was signed, the Cathars were still there. 20 years of warfare had killed perfects by the hundreds at Minerve, at Lavore, at dozens of smaller sieges. It had killed lay Cathars in the tens of thousands as collateral in the massacres of Béziers and other towns. But it had not killed the network. In the mountain villages of Foix and the High Pyrenees, in the households of surviving Occitan nobles, in the shepherd communities that summered above the tree line, Cathar perfects were still moving quietly through the population, still administering the consolamentum, still teaching that the material world was the work of Satan. The Roman Church had learned from 20 years of open warfare that armies could not reach these people. It was time for a different weapon. In April 1233, Pope Gregory IX, Innocent III's nephew and his ideological heir, issued 2 bulls that changed European history. They removed the persecution of heresy from the hands of local bishops. They transferred it to a new institution, answering directly to Rome. And they placed that institution under the operational control of a recently founded order of preaching friars, the Dominicans, the Order of Friars Preachers. This was the birth of the Papal Inquisition. It is worth understanding what was actually new. Torture was not new. Religious persecution was not new. What was new was the bureaucracy. Dominican inquisitors arrived in Languedoc with parchment. They set up permanent tribunals in Toulouse, Albi, Carcassonne. They opened registries. They summoned every adult in a town to be interviewed one by one about the religious activities of their neighbors going back decades. They cross-referenced testimonies. They recorded who had been seen visiting whose house. They named informers. And they filed the records in indexed archives that could be consulted years later by different inquisitors, allowing them to catch inconsistencies in a suspect's story. For the first time in European history, an institution was systematically applying record-keeping statistical analysis and long-memory bureaucratic surveillance to the interior of ordinary people's lives. This was the crude beginning of machinery that would be recognizable 700 years later as the modern surveillance state. For the Cathars, it was catastrophic. The perfects had survived the crusade by melting into a countryside that protected them. The Inquisition slowly demolished that protection. Every family that had sheltered a perfect was now vulnerable. Every villager who had witnessed a consolamentum could be questioned about it decades later. And once one thread was pulled, whole networks unraveled. Because the Dominican inquisitors kept the records, and they compared them. By the 1240s, the network was collapsing. The perfects, and their remaining protectors, retreated to a single final sanctuary, a fortress citadel called Montségur, perched at the top of a razor-thin limestone ridge nearly 4,000 feet high in the eastern Pyrenees. It was almost unreachable. It had held out through all of the crusade, and by 1243 it housed the last organized administrative center of the Cathar Church, with treasure, with archives, with more than 200 perfects living inside its walls. In May 1243, a royal siege began. It lasted 9 months. The mountain was too steep for conventional artillery, but the besiegers painfully hauled a trebuchet onto an adjacent peak and began smashing the outer defenses. By March 1244, the garrison was starving. On March 16, 1244, the survivors surrendered. The soldiers and lay believers were pardoned. But the perfects, more than 200 of them, were offered the same choice that had been offered at Minerve 34 years earlier. Recant or burn. Every one of them refused. They walked down the mountain trail together, holding hands, wearing black robes. At the base of the ridge, a wooden palisade had been built and filled with brushwood. They walked inside. The fire was lit. Not one of them, according to the eyewitness records the Inquisition kept, screamed as the flames took them. The place is called to this day the Champ des Cramés, the Field of the Burned. That was the effective end of the organized Cathar Church. But it was not the end of individual perfects. For another 77 years, a handful of them lived in hiding, moving through Pyrenean shepherd communities, teaching, quietly ordaining one another as they grew old, hunted by a bureaucracy that never forgot. The last of them was a man named Guillaume Belibast. He had been born poor. He had killed a man in a brawl in his youth. He had escaped prison. He had become a perfect while on the run. And by 1321, a century after the crusade, Innocent III had launched. He was the last known Cathar perfect anywhere in Christendom. A spy the Inquisition had planted in his community betrayed him. He was arrested at a border crossing. He was tried by the Archbishop of Narbonne, and on August 24, 1321, at a small village called Villarouge-Termenée, he was burned at the stake. With him died the entire Cathar priesthood. There was no one left to administer the consolamentum. The theology continued to be believed quietly in a few families for another generation. Then it faded. Within 100 years, the only trace of the good men left in southern France was in the archives of the men who had killed them. And that is where the story ends. But it is not what the story means. Because the Albigensian Crusade did three things to Europe that outlasted every one of its participants. The first was moral. Before 1209, the concept of a crusade, the concept of holy war carrying spiritual reward, had been reserved in theory and in practice for war against non-Christians. When Innocent III wrote Rem Gravi in Quadam and offered the same indulgences for killing Cathars that had been offered for killing Muslims, he broke that distinction forever. From that point on, a Christian army could be raised blessed by the Pope and sent to slaughter fellow Christians inside Europe on the grounds that they believed the wrong things. That moral machinery would be used again against the Hussites, against the Protestant, in the wars of religion that killed a third of Germany in the 17th century. The second was institutional. The Papal Inquisition, born in the ruins of Languedoc in 1233, invented something the modern world takes for granted: a permanent bureaucratic apparatus dedicated to policing the interior life of ordinary citizens. It cross-referenced testimony. It kept archives. It rewarded informers. It coerced confessions and recorded them in standardized forms. When European monarchies began 400 years later to build the first modern secret police forces, they did not have to invent the model. It had been invented in Occitan, Languedoc by Dominican friars. The third was geographical. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1229, France, as we know it today, did not yet exist. The Kingdom of France ended roughly at the Loire. Everything south of it, a Mediterranean civilization that spoke Occitan, wrote its own literature, and ran its own trade with Italy and Spain, was independent. 20 years of holy war and a century of quiet inquisitorial pressure afterward ended that. The Languedoc, the language of the troubadours, of Finamore, of the mocking Cervantes, was slowly downgraded from the language of a court to the dialect of peasants. Toulouse, Béziers, Carcassonne, Narbonne, Nîmes. Cities that had been independent capitals became provincial towns of Paris. The map of modern Europe, the shape of the French hexagon that every school child recognizes, was drawn in fire and inquisitorial ink between 1209 and 1321. That is what the Albigensian Crusade accomplished. Not the destruction of a heresy, the destruction of a civilization, and the invention of a machinery of internal terror that has been part of European statecraft ever since. Which brings us back one final time to the morning of July 22nd, 1209, to the walled city of Béziers, to the Church of St. Mary Magdalene with its wooden doors and its terrified congregation. We opened with a question. How does the same church that had sent knights across the sea to fight Muslims end up marching a Christian army to slaughter a Christian city in the middle of Christendom? The answer the whole story keeps circling is that the church that morning did not think it was killing Christians. It thought it was cleaning a wound. It had convinced itself that the people inside those church doors were something worse than infidels, something worse than heretics. That they were a spiritual infection inside the body of Christ, and that killing them was not murder, but surgery. Nobody at Béziers thought they were doing anything wrong. That is the specific, uncomfortable thing to sit with. The soldiers who battered down the doors of St. Mary Magdalene, the legate who ordered the sack, the Pope who had signed the bull that made it legal, every one of them believed with total sincerity that they were saving Christendom, and that more than the number of the dead is why Europe would spend 800 years trying to understand what happened at that church door. Because the terrifying thing about the Albigensian Crusade is not simply that it was an atrocity. Plenty of medieval wars were atrocities. The terrifying thing is that it was a well-organized, theologically rigorous, sincerely believed atrocity carried out by people who thought they were on the side of God. The ruins of Béziers are gone. The Troncavel castles are gone. The Languedoc as a language of high culture is gone. The Cathars are gone. And every one of those absences is a piece of the answer the Crusaders gave that morning at the church door when they were asked how to tell the heretics from the Christians. They chose not to answer the question. And so, in a very real sense, the answer became the map of Europe.